What is up, everybody? This is Alex from IHE TV, and today I'm talking about Chris Stuckman's Shelby Oaks. So there are three main angles I want to cover when talking about this, because you can't really avoid these three things as major discussion points around this movie. Those being first, I already prefaced it, Chris Stuckman, which I guess this is a review of mine that has, I don't know, a little bit of a conflict of interest. Chris has been on my channel, he's been on the podcast, and I'm super happy that he's managed to leverage this audience on YouTube into a successful Kickstarter campaign being picked up by Neon. I couldn't be happier for him. But that's not going to stop me from being honest about how I felt about the movie. I've always thought that if a YouTuber wants to pivot into making films, that horror would be the genre to go for. Just on a pure practicality level. You can't have your first film be this big, grand, operatic, sci-fi epic, unless you're super connected or of some kind of way in. But horror gives you a lot of freedom, actually. You can be looser with the plot. People are generally more forgiving of bad performances and tropey stuff like that, because horror fans, they're loyal, and everyone likes getting scared. So I kind of guess the best and worst thing about it is that Chris Stuckman made it. It's the only thing that really makes it notable as a project to me. It's nice to have more examples of films that are watchable, that are professional, which doesn't sound like high praise, but from the perspective of YouTuber films, the 2010s were defined by some of the worst movies I think ever made from these YouTubers, giving the concept this stink that's slowly being turned around by, Raka Raka, Bo Burnham's pretty reliable. There are more and more examples, but yeah, look, we got Kick-Ass here, Fred the Movie, the Fred Trilogy, Suburban Nights, To Boldly Flee, Cinema Snob Movie, Smiley, that with Shane Dawson. Yeah, I remember that one. The Gummy Bear Movie. Oh my god, Dick Figures the movie. I haven't thought about dick figures in a long time, holy shit. Well, I remember this one being decent, the Ashens one, I like Ashens a lot. But that was one of the other tropes, is that if you're making your YouTuber movie, your character, quote unquote, or your YouTube persona has to be in it in one way or another. Hence, the Fred movie, the Ashens thing, Angry Video Game Nerd, the movie. But the Raka Bros, what they did with Talk to Me is kind of cleanse the palette, and only this year have proven that they're not one-trick ponies in the horror space. They're bringing something unique, fresh, and about equally good films from these pretty small budgets. But going back to Shelby Oaks, the budget is even smaller here. We're talking pretty much micro-budget stuff, so only about $1.5 million for this, which is important when thinking about the discussion of how it came together. But unlike some of these YouTuber movies, like Not Cool or whatever, I think what got this so much more attention and word of mouth and popularity was the idea that it was someone who criticized movies making his own movie. So as it had the three major angles: Stuckman, the idea of YouTuber movies, and lastly the idea of the horror genre and what this film is adding to it. And the answer is not that much. If you're familiar with the genre, you've seen fragments of this movie before. Keep bringing up something like A Talk to Me, which also has obvious roots in other horror stories from the past, but it was able to elevate itself with a strong personality, a really infectious energy, and creative concepts, where this is more of a standard paranormal investigator YouTubers go missing, and the older sister takes it upon herself to try and find out the mystery of what happened. And while I think it got plenty right, especially establishing the location of Shelby Oaks and giving it a bit of history, a bit of meaning, I thought the structure was quite interesting, for the first 16 minutes being this mockumentary sort of style before transitioning into a more traditional presentation. But I thought that was quite efficient for just getting the context and preamble out of the way without having to have a bunch of awkward conversations of exposition dumps constantly, which so many horror movies trip up on. Keith David is in there for one scene. It's always nice to see him. And honestly, like a good use of him. As far as if you have Keith David for one scene, and all that's really happening in the scene is two people talking and it needs some gravitas and oomph to it, get Keith David to do it and it'll sell. I did like the inclusion of YouTube and the dedication to the old UI and everything. It was quite nostalgic. And didn't do the classic, well, YouTube is in a film, so it's all about, we went viral, and all the obvious cliches. Not to say there aren't cliches in here. So as is the case for basically every horror movie, you got to trickle out those answers and you got to have some kind of root cause to the horror. We're talking aliens, ghosts, serial killers, true crime stuff, supernatural, what we dealing with. And this was more like a Sinister or a Conjuring type thing, which aren't my favorite types of horror. I thought the first half was actually a lot stronger than the second. I didn't like the way it wrapped up and ended. I'm not going to spoil it in this video, not that there's too much to spoil. If you've seen a bunch of horror movies, you know what happens. I don't know if this is just a pet peeve for me and if it even bothers anyone else, but I really find there to be something anticlimactic when you name your villain, creature, entity thing, and the name just doesn't hit. I mentioned Sinister, and that's the best example, Bagul, where like a creepy design is undercut by this ridiculous name they keep saying. And I don't think the creature from this movie is Bagul level, but I didn't love it. It was quite B-movie, wasn't particularly scared by anything. There were some frightening concepts towards the end that I thought were pretty heavy. In a way, I didn't anticipate this film to go there, but it can't really figure out how to wrap up or move the plot into a satisfying conclusion. I thought, like, the last shot in particular I really didn't like. And this idea of it getting in its own way, I was complimenting the actual location of Shelby Oaks and how cool and creepy it is. And I don't know, I'm an atmosphere guy. I like indulging in the mood and the location. So after the fourth or fifth time there was the slowly looking backwards jump scare, I was kind of getting over it by then, where I wish it just had a level of confidence to know what was scary and what needed a sound effect in there. I didn't love some of the sound effects to emphasize things. So there'd be something scary conceptually happening in a scene, and to me it would overdo it with these emphasis sounds. We're so deep into the horror genre at this point, it's very challenging to make it stand out. And unfortunately for me, it fell into the bucket of those horror movies that if they've got a cool premise or a good hook, I get less and less scared the more the questions and concepts are explained, which is a delicate balance. You want some kind of explanation, but also you don't want to ruin the tension or the build-up. Although even in saying that, I still think I would lean more towards an under-the-skin style horror, where it is trusting the audience to interpret things or leaving things open, which is kind of like the inverse of this movie, where the final shot does that cinema trope I'm so sick of, where you like play a clip, an audio clip from earlier in the movie in a way that feels like I got a bad memory, but I can remember something that happened like an hour ago. And it just feels like you're over-explaining it to make sure the audience understands, even though it's not particularly complicated at all. So I'm probably not really going to think about this again. I gave this a 2-star with a like. Got to shout out the posters, actually. I think the marketing in general was really good, especially the posters. But I think a 2-star is fair. I'm personally much more interested how Chris leverages this success, because it is a resounding success. And the industry discussion is what is most interesting, because there are so many filmmakers out there where they just can't find a way to get into the industry. They can't get that foot in the door. So I think it's perfectly valid to use your audience you built up on social media to try and make things happen for yourself. I think that's really cool. But there's a certain amount of pressure, a different kind of pressure than that the Rackers had after Talk to Me, where their thing is more about maintaining a certain level of quality or creativity. I want to see what Chris can do with a bigger budget. So if Talk to Me had a $4.5 million budget and what they're able to achieve there, I'd love to see what he can do with more resources. So maybe he can indulge more in some of the bigger concepts I'm sure he has in his head. I'm not really sure what this film would have looked like pre the neon reshoots, which supposedly added some of the more gory stuff towards the end, because it already kind of felt like a bit of an anticlimax to me in the state I saw it in. So I don't know, I sound like I'm being really negative, but I think it's just a fair review of what this movie is. It just has the added element of Chris Stuckman being the director, and that's most of what I spent this video talking about. So I think a solid first film. There are so many directors, if you look at their filmography and go to their first movie or 2 or 3, and you can see the clear trajectory of how they've wound up as who they are today. There's so many examples. Like James Cameron, he directed Piranha 2, Park Chan-wook's early stuff. David Fincher did Alien 3. Like, that is the creative journey. Not everyone's going to have Get Out or The Evil Dead as their first movie. There's so much luck and timing and schmoozing and strategy and all the business side to navigate beyond just trying to get your story out there, which I think he's doing well so far. So looking forward to see what he does in the future. Let me know your thoughts on Shelby Oaks. Did it work for you? Did it not work for you? Let me know, and I'll see you on the next vid. Bye!